Hello, my name is Brian Havel, and I'm Director of the International Aviation Law Institute at DePaul University College of Law here in downtown Chicago. This is the 8th installment in our oral history series, Conversations with Aviation Leaders, which explores the origins, history, record, and future direction of U.S. domestic airline deregulation and international airline liberalization, as told through the voices and memories of those who participated in those events. Our format today, as it has been in all previous sessions, will be 3 one-hour sessions, and we will be paying special attention today to the aeropolitical relationship between the United States and its very first open skies treaty partner, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But today's interviewee, Paul Vladimir Mifsud, former KLM Vice President for Government and Legal Affairs in the United States, will also travel back to the period before the arrival of a formal U.S. open skies policy in the early 1990s and tell us about the first stirrings of an international air transport liberalization regime during the preceding decade or more. Welcome, Paul. It is fitting indeed, Paul, that we meet you at the end of 2015, the year in which you were awarded the L. Welsh Pogue Honour for Lifetime Achievement in Aviation in recognition of your important contributions to international aviation policy and cooperation. As I indicated, for most of your career from 1994 to 2010, you were Vice President, Government and Legal Affairs, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines in Washington, D.C., and General Counsel USA for KLM from 1976 to 1994. In those capacities, as the Pogue Committee recognized, you were on the front lines of major strategic developments that led ultimately to the current major branded global airline alliances. You were involved in negotiations that included an attempt by American Airlines to form a North Atlantic alliance with KLM, something I didn't know about until I was researching your biography. You were also involved in the famous KLM Northwest Alliance, which was the first to be awarded antitrust immunity, and I suspect that you were very much involved in inventing the idea of antitrust immunity for alliances. And that certainly was the episode that created the idea. You were involved in the KLM Air France merger, the metal-neutral joint venture, using a technical term that we'll talk about, among Delta, Air France, KLM. Your career goes back further to working with British Airways in New York after its formation from a merger between the British Overseas Airways Corporation and British European Airways, very nostalgic names for aviation buffs. And you helped gain approval of supersonic Concorde flights into the United States. And I understand the Concorde's coming back. Is that true?
I heard that too, but I don't think so.
There's a rumor. And there's a great new book about the Concorde that's just appeared, a biography of the Concorde. You were a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia, a law graduate from Rutgers University, an SEC trial attorney, founder of the MIFNet International Aviation Forum, the Federal Bar Association's Transportation Lawyer of the Year, and the Queen of the Netherlands bestowed on you the Order Orange Nassau for your efforts leading to the first open skies agreement with antitrust immunity for KLM Northwest. Despite the resonant sound of your last name, you were not Dutch, but American, and originally from various backgrounds, including Maltese. But obviously you were much honored and respected in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Paul, let's begin the discussion, part 1, this hour, which we've called Getting to Open Skies, from Bermuda to Open Cities, 1973 to 1990. So quite a long stretch of time. And you began your career in aviation, as I said, with BOAC, before embarking on a long and distinguished career with KLM. Can you briefly summarize for our audience how you became involved with aviation law and what caused you to devote your entire career to that wonderful field?
Well, I was working at the SEC, enjoyed the job very much in the Enforcement Bureau, and became discouraged with the direction of the policies at the SEC, and particularly the revolving door. Everybody that was in my class at the SEC saw a career in government as a bad thing and couldn't wait to get into the industries that they were regulating. And I felt uncomfortable being part of it, and left the SEC and looked for businesses that didn't have stock. And at that time, BOAC was state-owned and didn't participate in the stock market, and it was one of the jobs I sent an application to.
And what job was that in the United States?
Assistant Counsel USA, working with Bill Clark, who had been working with Pan Am before they had just started an in-house legal department.
And what year was this?
1976, 76, I believe, 74. No, I came to KLM in 76, it was 74.
74, so quite a few years, 5 years before Mrs. Thatcher's election and the decision to privatize.
That's right.
So you felt this was going to be a lifetime sinecure.
I don't know about lifetime, but it was an exciting opportunity with an exciting new area. I was working with a person who had been trained by out of the same legal department that Judge Friendly came from at Pan Am. And so I got an incredible background and a great training with Bill Clark.
Well, it seems that you have, throughout your career in the United States, been, shall I use the term, U.S. counsel for a foreign airline. I mean, that seems to have been...
That has been my career.
That has been your career.
Then, yes.
Can you tell us what it means to be U.S. counsel for a foreign airline? And what does one do in that role? There must be an element of lobbying as well as a good deal of law.
I don't know that there are very many left in the business anymore. At the time I went in, it was an era of real regulation, and by that I mean fares, rates, destinations. Everything was everything required government approval and special applications. Rebating was fares were set once a year, once a season. And rebating was a legal violation. And one of my early...
What is rebating? What does that mean?
You were only allowed to charge the fare approved by the government. Mm-hmm. And if you were charging less than the fare approved by the government would come after you. And not only that, but there was IATA, the International Air Transport Association, had a special trial for travel agents and
a court-martial.
Well, they fined them, and you participated in these trials for agents who were violating the IATA rules.
Was it incumbent on you at any time to report rebating by travel agents, for example?
It became incumbent after a criminal investigation by the Eastern District in the mid-'70s.
And how did that occur in practice? This
well, what
reporting?
happened? The way the case happened was there was an airline flying in Belgium called Sabina, which you'll remember, and the agent came into the United States with $80,000 in his socks, and that money was being sent over to bribe agents to put people on Sabina. And at first they thought they had a drug dealer. And then they found out they had, and when the Sabina was brought in to face the law, it was a criminal violation in American law. And when he was brought in, they said, everybody does it. And I was working at BOAC at the time. And everybody said, oh, no, we don't do it at British Airways. It's KLM and Sabina, the small airlines. That's the only way they can get the traffic, is to break the rules. And in fact, KLM was accused of being a pirate breaking the rules, as you know.
Yeah.
So the end result of all of this was that both KLM and Sabina pointed their fingers at British Airways, and before the dust cleared, it turned out that Pan Am, TWA, all of the American airlines, well, in that time there was only a few international American airlines, and most of the foreign airlines flying across the North Atlantic, all had their fingers in the till, as it were, distributing cash and doing this kind of rebating. And it was how people were getting special deals from these special travel agents to get them to Europe.
So the travel agents were the recipients of this bribery.
Yeah, but but it was being passed on to the customer.
And passed on to the customer to generate traffic.
That was the way they got the traffic. So they would set these high fares, and everybody that abided by the high fares would have to pay them, and the rebates would all go to the customers. There was some of them were being run out of spice shops in in Chinatown. I mean, it was all over the place. There were these ethnic groups that were doing it. It was an interesting time.
It says a lot about the notion of regulated industries that this occurred.
So the industry pleaded guilty in court and were subject to a consent decree. And the consent decree, they sought to enforce the consent decree and actually put in jail an executive from Iberia Airlines when he continued to do it. And so it shut down the rebating thing, and I think contributed to the then ongoing desire to liberalize international aviation.
Do you think that after liberalization, after the arrival of open skies, just to jump forward for a moment, the role of the U.S. Consul, that you said had diminished somewhat in the intervening years, was further reduced by the absence of all this regulatory apparatus?
Yeah, open skies, I think, was the final. Yeah, I worked hard at putting myself out of business.
It seems that you did.
It's when you get to the point where you can go to any city, you can charge any fare, you can do all those things. You know, it comes down to the role of inside counsel then is contracts, leases, airport negotiations, that sort of thing.
And less crime investigation.
And much less crime investigation, much less the nuances of aviation.
Well, at some point, British Overseas Airways and British European Airways merged. Did that create legal issues in the United States for you to tackle?
Not as many as they would have had the company been a public company. You didn't have the same concerns about antitrust law. It was a government-owned entity, and the government was just merging its the two owned entities. It was the owner of both, and as such, didn't involve antitrust issues that would have happened with other kinds of mergers. Didn't involve many of those kinds of issues.
What year did the merger take place? Can you recall?
Well,
because you were clearly still U.S. Consul at that point.
Well, one of the jobs that I did was I had to make sure that all the leases that were in the name of BOAC were changed to British Airways, and there were some problems with that kind of thing because was that a sublet, or landlords would try to get a little extra money for those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So I had to go through all of the contracts, all of the leases. There were filings with the CAB at the time and the FAA that had to be, everything had to be name changes and things of that sort.
But no permission was sought from CAB or FAA for this merger?
No, we had to change the permits and things of that sort, so I guess that technically was permission, but
right.
It was expected that, this is the British government doing it, so there was no real, there was no concern about that kind of thing.
And why did they merge? What was the thinking behind that?
Well, as we know, the end result was that they were thinking about privatizing it.
Were they at that early stage? Well, that was before, wasn't that before Thatcher arrived?
That was, but they put that kind of thing was being talked about in the UK.
Why do you think that became an issue in the UK?
Well, they felt that the competitive situation was changing dramatically in aviation. The introduction of the 747 suddenly tripled overnight the amount of capacity that was being offered on the North Atlantic, and this fare structure was struggling under this formalized fare structure where the airlines got together and agreed on the fare, and then all the governments of the world had to sit down and approve these fares.
That was the cartel, International Air Transport Association.
The IATA fare procedures that existed at that time, the real regulation. It was being done nationally in the U.S. as well, but that was coming undone in 1978 with the Deregulation Act. And that was already being discussed in the U.S. So you had a major change in the economics. Airlines had to go to their governments for bailouts because in the first instance, they went to their governments to buy the 747s and then have it to compete. And having overnight gone from the 29 that Pan Am bought to the hundreds that were being bought by all the foreign airlines, suddenly the 120-seat airplane became a 370-seat airplane, and multiplied by all the airlines, and still under this fare structure. They were putting pianos on 747s, you recall, right? Because they had lots of room in those days.
Oh, and all under a single high fare. So
Yeah, exactly.
offering the piano.
And then they stopped rebating.
And then they had to stop rebating.
Yes.
You know, it seems to me that there must have been some pushback in Britain against the merger because the British are so nostalgic about their institutions, and here were two rather revered institutions suddenly being obliterated, with the more generic name British Airways replacing them. Do you think there was any feeling that that was a retrograde step in terms of the sentimentality aspect?
The British kept so much of the workforce on both sides. And there were a number of, it was thought in those circles that by and large the BOAC people were the pilots of the RAF. They kind of gravitated towards BOAC, the international one, and the local one, which was just flying to the continent. The BEA was thought to be the engineers and workers on the aircraft for the RAF, and the people at BOAC thought of themselves as well. We're still the officers, and so they had the overseas division and the European division. So the merger was more in name than in actual practice. It took several years and the privatization to change that situation.
Well, you didn't stay with British Airways.
No.
Although by the time you left, it had become British Airways.
Yes.
It? So what motivated you to switch? And in addition to that, tell us about KLM during that period. How was it different from the British carriers?
Well, the motivation was I was number 2 at British Airways, and the opportunity at KLM would have made me number 1.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. in a smaller one-man legal department, but still my own legal.
But still number 1.
A big fish in a small pond was essentially my focus on the thing, and I went there, and I got there because of my SEC experience. It turns out that the consent decree, which had been entered into while I was at British Airways, was patterned after the SEC consent decrees, where the SEC would go in and find people guilty of violating the securities laws. And the company would consent to a pattern of behavior afterwards, which would subject them to contempt of court, criminal sanctions, if they violated it. And this is what the consent decree was in the rebating. And I had experience at the SEC in consent decrees.
The rebating consent decree was issued by which authority?
By the federal court in Southern District, in the Eastern District of New York.
Right, you had mentioned the Eastern District, yeah.
And all consent decrees originate out of the court because it's the contempt of court that gives the muscle to it. Mm-hmm. And KLM, being the Sixth Freedom carrier that it was.
We'll talk about Sixth Freedom.
Required a lot of oversight. They were very worried that everybody would be looking at them because, as I told you, the first fingers were pointed at KLM and Sabina in that whole thing. And so they were still regarded as the pirates.
Well, before we talk about their piracy, again, KLM was different from the British carriers. Probably the Sixth Freedom was one aspect of the difference. But can you provide us with some sense of KLM's unique place in the post-World War II international aviation marketplace?
Most people don't appreciate how important KLM was before World War II. At the onset of World War II, KLM was the third largest international carrier in Europe. After Imperial Airways, which became BOAC, and Lufthansa. It was bigger than the French carrier, for example. And it was the oldest airline in Europe and had been flying to Indonesia and all over the world from the Netherlands.
The Dutch colonies.
Dutch colonies. Colonialism was a big part of the international model in those days. And the British had a very mercantile view of that. They would go to their colonies and have their colonies stop the Dutch carrier from coming. And there was a battle between the two that went before World War II. After World War II, both the British were concerned about the Americans, who now had these B-29s and had experience in airplanes that would become the transatlantic and trans-Pacific type of aircraft. And that was that became the main legal pressure after World War II that formed the Chicago Convention, that went in a different direction than the Havana Convention did for the rest of world trade. The Dutch saw that coming because they knew what the British were capable of from before. So there was a real tension between the British and the Dutch before the war. The British saw themselves as a small country and saw how quickly they could be isolated. Colonialism was threatened at that point, having lost their colonies to the Japanese, and now trying to get them back was not an easy task for countries that had been devastated by the bombs of World War II. So you had a whole different perspective. The British Empire was bigger and lasted longer than the Dutch Empire. And so when I got into KLM, you had a company who had lost its empire, trying to claw its way back into the ranks.
A company and a country that had lost its empire.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And you had the British Airways, which saw itself as the instrument of the British government, and still had, we still had the colonies, that lasted at a much longer time, and still had the relationships with the colonies, with the common market that they had set up. And this was the entrepreneurial people of the Dutch and the establishment people of the British. It was quite a different culture.
The culture of the Dutch has always been a free trade culture, hasn't it? Being a small maritime nation, needing to enter the international trade lanes.
And a special quality of the Dutch was that because they're such a small country, surrounded by Germany and France, and British on the other side, they were a company that prided themselves on being more tolerant of differences, political differences. So they were more receptive to the growing global economy. They were more receptive to new cultures. So I found myself at British Airways. Bill Clark and I had a Declaration of Independence on our door, because with the British, the legal issue, every time there was a legal issue with the Americans, the British would come in and, how can they do this? Whereas the Dutch were much more respectful of the American law and say, what can we do? And so there was that's essentially the different approach.
I see. Well, now you mentioned Sixth Freedom traffic. Was KLM the first to exploit that concept? First of all, what is it? Secondly, who invented the term? Because it's not in any convention. It certainly isn't in the Chicago Convention. Well, none of them is.
Well, when I was at KLM, we never used that term.
Would somebody tell you not to use it?
I was told not to use it.
Who told you that?
Or Wassenberg.
We'll talk about Orr Wassenberg also. But what was Sixth Freedom traffic? Was KLM the first to exploit the concept? How was it received by other countries? And you didn't acknowledge what you were doing, you said.
Well, this goes back again to the Chicago Convention. After World War II, there were two major conventions held, one in Havana that set up the GATT system that has now morphed into the global trade that we have today. And we had another in Chicago that set up the economic model for aviation. One was a multilateral model, the other ended up being a bilateral model. And the reason it did is that they set out to make them both multilateral. But the Chicago Convention, as you know, failed primarily because of the organization led by the British of foreign airlines, war-torn foreign airlines, who did not want to be dominated by America in the aviation market. And so everybody insisted on having a private agreement with the Americans and with each other for any kind of trade. And that still exists today. And that's still the core model today. It's been modified by a number of the things we will talk about.
Yes.
But the two diverged paths at that point. And at that Chicago meeting, the model for exchange that they were talking about as a multilateral was what they called the 5 freedoms. And as you teach each of your students, the first freedom was the right to overfly. The second freedom was the right to fly and pick up fuel, but not passengers, and to continue. The third freedom was the economic freedom, the freedom to take up passengers in your country and fly them to the country, your bilateral partner country, and drop them off. The fourth freedom was the right to pick up passengers in your country and fly them to the bilateral partner. And the exchange of third and fourth freedom were the primary, became the primary exchanges. Fifth freedom was the right to pick up passengers in the host country, fly to your country, pick up more passengers, and fly to a third country. And that was thought to be all you needed to make aviation work. And had the aviation agreement been multilateral, it would have been much more like what we see in maritime. Instead, where you had freedom of the seas. Instead, what you ended up with is this bilateral model. And the Dutch, with a small market, could hardly fill an airplane just for the Amsterdam market. So what they did is they sold tickets to Rome in New York, but they would print it on 2 tickets. One ticket was New York to Amsterdam. The other ticket was Amsterdam, Rome. The Dutch argued that we have fourth freedom rights between Amsterdam and Rome, and we have third freedom rights between the U.S. And Amsterdam. Where the passengers go after they land in Amsterdam is none of your business, U.S. And for years, they built their model on that. But a lot of people said, no, it's something else. It's not fifth freedom, because we didn't give you the right to fly them over but we said, no, we're not. They bought another ticket, and that ticket is from Amsterdam no, that's well, if it's not fifth freedom, then it must be sixth freedom.
How was it advertised to the public?
It was advertised to the public to fly to...
Through service with KLM
right,
to Rome?
Right, yeah.
Even though you didn't have the traffic rights
exactly
directly?
Exactly.
You only had traffic rights to Amsterdam?
That's right. But we did have traffic rights to Rome.
Through what process?
Through the bilateral process. Through the bilateral process with the Italian government.
But did you have, that was effectively, would that be a fifth freedom from the United States?
Well, no, it's fifth freedom if you sell them one ticket all the way to Rome.
Yeah.
And you didn't take them off the airplane and put them on another airplane and take them away.
Right.
I mean, it was perfectly legal.
And why did Wassenberg think that it shouldn't be disclosed, or the term shouldn't be used?
Well, because it was a made-up term to stop the Dutch from doing what they were doing.
And who made it up?
The Americans were the first to use it.
Were they?
Yeah. Although other people were using it as well. I mean, any of the major, in those days, it was thought that traffic belonged to the country. And it wasn't that the customer had the right to choose. It's that these are our customers and we keep them. And that was the model. It was a very mercantile system that continues today.
Well,
We'll talk about that later.
we will, but clearly this was an enormous issue in 1974, in the mid-70s, when you arrived, and the U.S.
But it wasn't initially. Initially, the U.S. And the Dutch were on the same side. At Chicago, the Americans were looking for an open skies, freedom of the skies regime, and the Dutch were their partners in this. I have files in my office that talk to that issue, saw how much effort the Dutch played in trying to bring that about. And every year after the Chicago Convention came into effect, for the first 5 years, the Americans tried to go back to the table to undo the bilateral regime and get this multilateral regime. And then somewhere in the early 50s, I believe, the British and the Americans got together, and that was the end of trying to look for a multilateral regime. The Americans then drank the Kool-Aid, as it were.
Are you talking about Bermuda One?
Huh?
You're talking about Bermuda One.
Well, Bermuda One was regarded as a temporary thing by the Americans. That was in the early 40s, late 40s. For several years after that, they would go back to Chicago every year and try to get the multilateral regime. But by then, it had hardened into concrete. The Americans said, okay, we're going to accept it. Pan Am was instrumental in trying to get that to happen. They saw what the Dutch were doing on their sixth freedom and wanted their market and wanted, if we had that market, we'd be a much stronger carrier, and it's important to the national security that you have strong American airlines.
Well, couldn't Pan Am have operated sixth freedoms maybe from Europe through the United States to Latin America?
Well, the Americans, all of the countries with big markets, that is, destinations that everybody wanted to go to. New York in those days, London, Paris, Rome, Frankfurt. These were cities that attracted large quantities of people naturally. They were the Amsterdam, Belgium, Denmark. These were small countries that people might go to, but there was very little home market for them and very little, natural markets for any of these companies.
And there wasn't a mass tourism industry at that time.
But even then, when you're dealing with a country the size of the state of Maryland, and the city of Amsterdam didn't even have 1 million people in it.
It was a tiny market.
It's a very tiny market, and so you needed that extra. And you're talking about the airline that before all of this came into place was the third largest in Europe.
But depending on its colonies for the traffic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this was the situation that everybody had found themselves in. It solidified in the 50s. By then, the practices had already developed. The Americans at Bermuda, as you noted, were able to keep one thing in the free market attitude that the British wanted to control as well. The Bermuda Agreement controlled fare and market access. All fares had to be approved by both sides. All destinations had to be agreed in advance. And the Americans were able to keep, and the British wanted to also decide how many seats could be sold on each airline and how many airlines could fly. And the Americans, having a large market of air carriers and having the free market mentality, said, no, we don't want that. And so they they fudged on the capacity issue. They said capacity equal to the market.
Capacity could be judged ex post facto.
Exactly.
Right.
And they kept capacity out, and that got the British, that was the British compromise. They said, okay, we'll let you have it this time. And so as we move forward, we were faced with a situation where the Americans were now, as they got further and further from the partnership they had with the Dutch, and more complaints from Pan Am and TWA about the Dutch, they started putting pressure on Congress and on the CAB to do something about it. And by the time I got to KLM, they were under order to cut back their capacity. KLM was under its orders to cut back its capacity by 2/3.
Now, this took 2 decades to develop, judging by the timeline that you're suggesting.
Exactly.
It only surfaced as a major issue, a public policy issue in 1974 or thereabouts.
That's right.
So before then, it was perhaps nudging KLM to be a little more cautious.
This was after the introduction of the 747.
Precisely,
and
yes.
all the extra capacity that was there.
Right.
All of the airlines were hurting, and they pointed to the pirates at KLM and this illegal
Who
Sixth
used the
Freedom
term
thing.
pirates?
I don't know where it originated, but I know that it was regularly used in conversations I would have at conferences and such.
But pirates in what sense? Because
You were
you weren't boarding other people's aircraft.
You were stealing traffic.
Stealing traffic.
So it was stealing traffic. You had no right to those passengers. They may have chosen you, but you had no right.
So formally there was a pushback by the Civil Aeronautics Board. Tell us about that process.
That process went on. The Dutch asked for talks. They had negotiations. Kissinger got involved in them, in fact. At one point, the order was due to go into effect, and there was a NATO order for jets. And the French were trying to get their Mirage jets to be accepted as the NATO aircraft. And the Dutch were key participant in the decision, the European decision of which way to go. And so the Dutch decision to buy the American jets bought KLM another year. And I came in at about that time.
At about that time.
But the whole process and the length of the process, the government negotiations and all the processes that happened under the bilateral, caused the British to say, hey, that capacity issue that we left on the table in Bermuda, it's back on the table again. We've decided that you're right. Capacity has to be more regulated. We've looked at your capacity and you're taking too much from our market.
So they thought that the U.S. was being hypocritical in attacking you, having previously taken such a liberal mindset.
No, well, they didn't. Well, they thought everybody should attack us. No, they didn't think that America was being hypocritical. They agreed with the Americans. They just wanted the Americans now to recognize that they too should have the adjustments that the Americans were seeking. And it was, they announced just as I left British Airways and went to KLM, they announced that they were rescinding the bilateral, and the terms of that were at the end of it would take a year if you renounced. So the bilateral continued to go, the Bermuda I agreement, but at the end of that bilateral, the British said, if we do not have an agreement, there will be no service between us. That had never been done. I don't know if it's ever been done, but the British threatened it. And in fact, as the deadline came, the British were putting ads in the newspapers. If you want to get to England, fly to Canada, we'll take you from there. And the Americans didn't have any choice. How do you you go to Canada, but you still can't fly to Britain on the American carrier?
But you can fly on British Airways.
Yeah, and so the Americans were like, what do we do? Most of the European countries agreed with the British. The Americans were too big. They were putting too many things in the market. Everybody had the 747s. They all had the same problems. And when I came to KLM and I found myself in the situation that the company was going to cut back by 2/3 of its revenue in one of its major markets, I suggested to Orr Wassenberg, I wrote him a memo, said, hey, this might be an opportunity to show some goodwill. Don't ask for anything, but just let them know that they could fly to Amsterdam. Show them that your heart is still in the right place, that we're still the one country they can count on for competition.
That the Americans could fly to Amsterdam.
That's right.
And thereby funnel passengers to Britain, to London.
Right. And at first I was told, well, that's a pretty silly thing to suggest.
This was your idea?
It was my idea.
How was it received in the company?
Initially, Orr was, because of the Sixth Freedom issue, the company was very sensitive to this issue. And Orr was was the founder of the Leiden Institute of Air and Space Law. He was,
Yes.
So he was the respected figure. They looked to him for his initial decision was no. I came back with and Orr was the kind of person where he encouraged intellectual discussion. So I came back intellectually, and he came back and said, okay, we'll try it. And I approached not the CAB at the time, but the DOT. There was, told them that they could tell Pan Am and TWA that they could fly to Amsterdam. In fact, Alan Boyd, who had the American negotiations, agreed at the 11th hour. I mean, literally the 11th hour of the last day, with all the ads in the paper on both sides, finally agreed to what we now know as Bermuda 2.
But couldn't they already fly? Couldn't the American Airlines already fly to Amsterdam? What were you offering additionally?
Oh, we were offering
increased
extra capacity. Oh, yeah.
How much increased capacity? It sounds like you were conducting international negotiations on your own behalf.
The Dutch access to across the English Channel, KLM continues to be one of the major carriers to most of the British markets besides London. In fact, when I was in Chicago with my British colleagues, would ask me for passes on KLM because it was easy for them to get to their homes in Manchester or other places.
But couldn't the British, in retaliation, have shut down your capacity from Amsterdam to London?
We had the bilateral right to do that. So we again, this is if they wanted to renounce the bilateral with us, they could have done that.
The British.
Yeah. So it wasn't. As it turned out, the British. I have a copy of a letter I still keep because Orr sent it to me as soon as it came in. After the deal, the British won the deal. They got their Bermuda 2.
Yes.
But then KLM got notice from the British government that their application for flights to Hong Kong had been rejected. And they specifically mentioned the help that we gave to Pan Am.
So very political, very aerodiplomatic.
It's the kind of world it was. And I went like that as I read the memos, and I thought, do I still have a job? It also was followed up by another memo from a Pan Am person who then went to the CAB demanding that they start action against KLM again.
Despite the help you had offered.
And I went to the colleagues at Pan Am that had been talking to me about how to get to Amsterdam and how to arrange it in case the deal fell apart. And Sewell, to his credit, the president, the CEO of Pan Am, sent a letter apologizing and instructed his staff to stop putting those kind of memos out.
You were certainly caught in the crosshairs, weren't you? I mean, things could have gone badly.
Well, it was, I was a young person. I wasn't as cautious as you get with experience. I was an inexperienced.
As I said, you were conducting foreign policy. And Wassenberg sounds like he was open to these radical suggestions.
Well, you were facing a situation where the case had been in court. By the time I had gotten there, the court case was lost.
The court case involving?
The cutback in capacity. KLM was going to lose that capacity. It didn't have that much more to lose.
So how did this court case happen? Did you bring an action against the CAB?
No, the CAB, part of keeping the CAB action from happening was first bilateral negotiations. That went on for a long period of time, postponed a bit by the interjection of Kissinger and the need for the jets. then there was court, and you had to stay in the order until the court heard the case, and then the court removed the stay and said, no, the CAB has this authority, you're out of luck.
So you challenged in court?
I didn't, KLM did.
KLM.
This had happened before I'd gotten there.
I see.
So it was,
and that was lost.
It was lost, and they were looking for, like, how do we get out of this situation? And so this was one possibility, and as it turned out, the British helped with the, all of this corresponded with the British Bermuda II agreement and talks, and so the Americans and now other European countries wanted to get a Bermuda II themselves. And here were the Dutch who had shown their loyalty in this critical moment. And that set the stage for what we call the period of liberal bilaterals.
But just going back again to the situation with capacity and the CAB, that was a pretty shocking demand that the CAB made. 2/3 of your transatlantic capacity to be taken down. It literally would have put KLM, well, it could have put KLM out of business on the transatlantic.
Absolutely. No, it was a great concern.
And on what basis did the court, do you recall, on what basis the court said that's an acceptable exercise of the CAB's authority?
Well, the CAB authority was subject to the president's approval. And this is foreign affairs.
I see.
And what you end up with, and you still see this today in trade issues as well, it's us against them. And rarely does the court, go against the U.S. government at the highest levels.
Yes.
And their interpretation. And as you saw, sixth freedom makes sense in terms of like, well, you're selling them here, you're going there. You look at the destination, you look at the outcome. Those weren't difficult legal issues for the court.
It was sort of a whistleblowing exercise by the U.S. carriers. I mean, they were watching what you were doing, and they told the cab that they didn't want you to do it.
Well, to this very day, it's regarded as these are our passengers, you're taking our passengers.
Is that something that appears in other aspects of international trade, that notion of the home market being exclusively the market of the national players, or is it something that aviation has as a special feature?
The Marine has certain amounts of that. Cabotage is illegal.
In maritime, yes.
In maritime. Mm-hmm. But the Havana Convention that was set in motion was designed against that kind of thing. Tariffs and that sort of stuff exist to protect home markets. Mm-hmm. So there are home market protections, but not the customers. You're protecting the industry,
right?
And you're dissuading the customers by making the other person charge
exactly.
a little bit more. These are our passengers, you can't have them.
So what they thought is that any passenger traveling to destinations beyond Amsterdam should fly with a U.S. airline.
Or the host country airline.
Or the host.
Bilateral. It's a bilateral.
It's a bilateral, yes. But if traveling to Amsterdam, they should just travel to Amsterdam.
That's right.
And then they should come back from Amsterdam.
That's right.
So basically, U.S. passengers going to Amsterdam, Dutch passengers coming from Amsterdam to the United States.
And if that
would define the market.
Yes, and if that had defined the market, that would have, had the U.S. defined the market on the North Atlantic, it would certainly have followed everywhere else.
Yes.
And it would have meant that the large carriers from the large markets would dominate aviation, and the small carriers would be left, with only their home market, and it wouldn't be very much economics in even having an airline.
How big was the U.S.-Dutch market, the third, fourth freedom market at that time?
I don't know how the specifics of the market. I know that at the time, roughly 1/3 of KLM's traffic was Dutch destination. 2/3 of it was beyond Holland.
And 2/3 of that 2/3 was to be taken down.
Right. Well, that was the 2/3 that were going to be taken down.
Oh, that was almost the whole thing was going to be taken down. It is interesting as a matter, as you say, of mercantilism. And you had some strong personal influence in that, but what happened next with the CAB's capacity action against KLM and the aeropolitical relations between the states? I mean, how do we get from an action to restrict capacity to a negotiation and signature of a liberal bilateral, as you said, in 1978 between the United States and the Netherlands? That's a long travel.
Yeah, well, the issue then became for the Americans. The Bermuda issue was much more important than the KLM issue. It was critically important to Pan Am, who had been accessing the British market. British market accounted for some 75% of all transatlantic traffic. And now it was being divided more evenly between the British carrier and the American carriers. New American carriers were coming into the fold with a more lenient CAB policy on the eve of deregulation. And they could no longer access the British market at all. That was part of Bermuda too, restricting the number of carriers that could travel there.
Right.
Other countries were now trying to get their own and were petitioning the U.S. government to have talks so they could have their own. And I had dinner with Wassenberg in The Hague, right as these things were developing, talking about what our contribution could be to American policy. And we went after, one of the interesting things about dealing with Americans on these kinds of things, the heart of the the American Revolution was fought against mercantilism. The Americans don't buy into mercantilism as a matter of principle.
Thomas Jefferson.
And competition is a very important thing. And so we were talking about cultural attitudes.
Yes.
And so we were sitting and we're having drinks over these cultural attitudes in this very nice restaurant. And then Orr said, then what we should do is stop focusing on this capacity issue, start focusing on the pricing issue. Let's liberalize pricing. We have a central market in Amsterdam. That's why our Sixth Freedom business is so profitable. And let's offer, instead of countries disapproving or approving the fares, let's have country of origin pricing. So that American carriers could charge anything they want in their market, and the Dutch can't say anything about it. And so they can come in, and whatever the fares they want to charge, they'll be able to charge in Europe. And the competition that the carriers surrounding the Dutch would face from these low fares would force more competition in this pricing. It came at the time when deregulation had already occurred, and Brock Adams at the DOT was convinced it was a good idea. I talked to one of his staff about it, and they talked to Brock. Brock flew to Amsterdam, and when they came back, Mike Levine, who you've interviewed, heard about it, and
he had his own theory.
He had his own theory, and he said, what it should be is double disapproval, and he started talking with the Swiss about that.
What did he mean by double disapproval? It sounds like a philosophical arms race among the liberalizers.
It was. And it's exactly what happened, is it set into motion this race to liberalize. And whereas the Dutch were reserving the right to tell KLM what fares they could or could not charge, they couldn't stop American carriers coming into their market. But the American carriers couldn't take from their market without the Dutch approval. Double disapproval meant that neither country could approve unless both countries disapproved.
Disapproved.
And so.
Well, how did that stack against country of origin? Which is the more liberal regime?
Oh, of course, the fact that now one country can't decide what the fares are going to be, even if it wanted to, because the other country, still they both had to get together and agree not to have the fare.
Yeah.
Up to now, they weren't even getting together. They approved them. They had to each approve it, and unless both approved it, it wouldn't happen. Mm. So it was a major difference in the pricing strategy.
Right.
And as a result of that, lots of neighboring countries, including the Germans, agreed to liberal bilaterals within a year of our doing the agreement.
And what was KLM's position toward liberalization different with respect to the U.S. than other markets? Were you talking to other markets about liberalization or focused entirely on the U.S.?
Well, surprisingly, as these things developed, several years later, The Dutch and the British agreed to the first open skies agreement between them,
The first
even as Bermuda II continued.
So there was some effect on other countries.
We were coming into the era of the single European market.
Well, we're now 5 years into an aviation law career that's one of the most dramatic and exciting periods of aviation history. We're going to continue this after the break.